I'm going to hand over almost directly to Sara, because we want to have at least 30 minutes for discussion. We can run over a little bit into our lunchtime, but we do want to leave a bit of time for networking too. Now, on my far left here is Sara Pantuliano, who many of you will know is the head of the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI. She's a political scientist with extensive experience in conflict and post-conflict context, and she's an internationally recognized expert on Sudan and South Sudan as well. And she has considerable on-the-ground experience in South Kordofan in particular, where she was the coordinator of the Nuba Mountains Impact program between 2000 and 2003. She was also the Italian government advisor to the Sudan peace process and remains engaged on Sudan issues, Sudan and South Sudan issues. So Sara, I'm going to ask Sara as our discussant to pull out some of the key themes and give us some of her views and insights on those. Sara?
Thanks, Wendy. Thank you very much. I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that I think this is a very important study, and I'm delighted that HPN has had the possibility of, supporting the publication of the study and the dissemination. I hope this is just the first of a series of meetings that will amplify some of the very important lessons that I think come out of the study. I don't think this is on. Is it? Is it working? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just try and elicit some of the things that for me are of critical importance to discuss. Niels, you've summarized very well at the beginning. I think what the study shows, very clearly is, the importance of self-protection strategies, how important they are to people, but also, the fact that they are often, unable to provide the degree of safety, security, and dignity that people need. These are often, distress strategies, and we've heard, from all the case studies, the extent to which actually they may expose people, to further risks. And which means, that in no way they can substitute for the protection responsibilities of national authorities, and where this fails, of, the international community. But this, this has emerged really well from the discussion, this profound disconnect, as you emphasize, between what people need and what they try to do, to meet that need, and what either the authorities or us as international providers try to do is immense. And I think the studies emphasize really well the extent to which people are inevitably forced to continue to rely on their ineffective strategies. And I think it's also especially in the case of Sudan, I'd say, but also Zimbabwe and Myanmar, a very damning account of the ineffectiveness of the international efforts. And when you think in the case of Sudan, international efforts that included a large peacekeeping mission, I mean, that is all the more troubling, if we think about also the significant resources that have gone into these international efforts. So I guess, the question is why? There's obviously been a lot of thinking over the last few years about, protection approaches, how to streamline them, how to put them in practice. A lot of structures have been set up. But, the feeling for me, just reflecting on this, more globally, is that actually the structures have moved us as, international aid actors more and more away from the people. They've actually created a divide rather than facilitate an engagement. Yeah. They've made the responses not nimble enough. On the contrary, as we were hearing just now, they've made the response more risk-averse, more constrained, more pre-established than they should have been. And so they've made the whole process, they've made the system, if there is one, unable to engage with local processes, local the specificity of what needs to happen locally, what already happens locally, which we could strengthen. There is one example in the South Kordofan case. Justin, you didn't mention it, but it's very clearly discussed in the report between on the peacekeeping level or ceasefire monitoring level, if you want, between the JMC, which was the Joint Military Commission, and UNMISS, the UN peacekeeping mission. The first was a kind of think out of the box response, a ceasefire monitoring mission that was put in place with very few international monitors, largely supporting the local response, providing a very kind of nimble and rather ad hoc, if you want, sort of ceasefire monitoring mechanism. And then, the very big traditional, UN peacekeeping mission that UNMISS was. And I remember, one of the last studies I've done in the area was probably 2007. People were making a comparison between the JMC and UNMISS, and the comparison was exemplified with, just one anecdote. The JMC used to stop at every village, ask us what was going on, what was happening, if we needed anything, and then, they would go and tell the agencies and would talk to, NGOs and others. UNMISS had the mandate to had the instruction of crossing the village as fast as possible, because that could have been a security risk for the personnel of the mission. And that was the perception of the local people. Obviously there was a number of reasons why one worked in one way and the other worked in another way, but generally there was, I guess, a structure and an attitude that did not facilitate local engagement, did not promote it, did not incentivize it. And that, I think, is what we need to reflect upon. I'll just draw out a few, I think, lessons that come out of the case studies for me, which are not new. These are things that we keep repeating. I mean, this is a discussion around local protection strategies. We may have another one generally about the aid system or food security approaches. They're the same in many ways. It's just when we're going to start putting them into practice. I mean, the first one for me is the importance of the long-term engagement. This study would have not been possible if Niels had not involved Justin, Simon, Ashley. These are people with a very long-standing understanding and engagement of this context. They were able to go in, do the studies that they have done, because they knew the context, they knew the people, they knew the actors, they knew how to engage them. And on the, at the local level, obviously there was the trust there to open up, share what was happening locally. Is that relation with the communities that you cannot improvise, and which the fast turnover that we have in many of the countries in which we operate does not allow to establish, does not allow to create. The second, and it came out very strongly again of the South Kordofan and Jonglei case studies, is the predictive capacity of local actors, the extent to which they know their threats, they know when they're going to come, they are able, to almost articulate, the date, what's going to happen and when. And on the other side, the lack of capacity we have to respond to that, because it may not be in our log frame. The third is the importance of, the tailored responses. And again, I mean, how many times have we said the context, above all, it's all context specific and obviously culture specific. I have to laugh at your hair extension story, because actually I was one of the, the people who went in with one of the first authorized missions from the UN into the Nuba Mountains. And so we also did some monitoring of, what had happened with the responses, the local responses supported by international donors beforehand. And the cash injections that you describe in the case studies were an interesting one, because actually, this was cash that went in as one of the very first cash operations, if you want, in the aid sector in the 90s. And part of it had been spent by the local communities to give money to the women to buy hair extensions from the local Arab traders at the local markets. So that was the choice of the people. Obviously, much as we could not understand, the importance of the hair extension, perhaps, in the context of the brutality of the war, these things provide an element of psychological relief that is important for the communities, and is as important as the food you need to put in your belly sometimes, especially for women who have been subjected to continuous threats and have been raped perhaps more than once, who have had to bear children out of rape. And last, last two issues is on obviously the inadequacy of the current peacekeeping operations that we have, and how they need. I mean, you say in the report, it's not about thinking how we can improve peacekeeping. It's really to think what alternative peacekeeping arrangements we can think of. That probably is where we should move the debate in some ways. I mean, there is a process at the moment, the integrated mission planning process is taking place at the moment, and so probably we need to think about the type of advocacy that we want to bring around, how it should change, how mandates should change, what the missions does versus what agencies do, or the NGOs do, need to change. And the last point is on the advocacy. advocacy to whom, informed by whom, with what aims, which again it's crucial because as we've seen in the Nargis case, but also in South Kordofan, we're seeing now you can have advocacy that's actually quite, and we've seen it in Darfur, of course, quite counterproductive, especially, and add more stress and undermine local protection efforts and not provide an international protection benefit either. I guess the question that I leave for the discussion is, well, who will lead the rethink? Again, these are not new issues. We've been discussing them forever, but who has got the responsibility of pushing the change that is so badly needed? Now, obviously, we've got a global protection structure, a global protection cluster. I do hope that some of the discussion will resonate and there'll be some reflection at that level as well of what it means in terms of starting to retailer our assistance. But ultimately, again, this is one of the structures that perhaps is moving us away from the reality. It's really down to individual agencies to rethink how they operate, the extent to which they engage, how they can make sure that their assistance is much closer to the reality of the people on the ground.
Sara, thank you very much for that.